Hello everybody, this is Scott Clement. I'm the Director of Product Development and Support at Propound Logic Software. Most people though who know me actually know me from other things, mainly from writing articles. I've published about 1,000 articles over the years. And I also participate a lot in online communities, including both open source on IBMI and like discussion groups like midrange.com and so forth. And of course from speaking at different events, including most of Commons events, such as the annual conference, fall conference, and webinars like this one. So hello, this talk is about what I call 3 approaches to web with RPG. So the basic idea here is that we're going to talk about writing RPG web applications. First thing I want to do, just so that everyone kind of gets the gist of the whole thing, is to give you a basic review of web technology. We can't go into too much depth, but just so that everyone kind of understands how web technology works. We're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk about the history of how web development was done. And based on that, I want to talk about, first of all, is web development in RPG a good idea or not? And then I want to talk about the choices, which are, should I use Web 1.0 type strategy or Web 2.0 strategy or open access? So let's go ahead and get started. First of all, I wanted to review web technology. So this is the most basic thing used in web technology. It's a document format called HTML. When you take a web browser and point it at a site, it downloads a file called an HTML file. And in that, you'll have these things called HTML tags. So here you see the start of this document has a less than sign followed by a word followed by a greater than sign. That's what's called an HTML tag or an opening tag. In this case, the tag itself is called HTML. And what it does is that it identifies this document as an HTML document. So we've got less than HTML, greater than tag. Everything between this and its ending tag, and its ending tag is down here at the bottom. Everything in between those is considered the HTML document. Now I know it's the ending tag because it's the same tag with a slash in front of it, so the slash means that it's the ending tag. Alright, so this is an HTML document because it's all between the HTML tags. And that's kind of how tags works. Everything inside of them identifies it as being under that tag. So the body of the document is where you can see the document. So we've got body here. That's the data you would see on a screen. And this first thing which says this is a heading, you can see that this is in a tag called H1. So H1 starts there and ends there. And H1 means heading level 1. So you've got heading level 1, which is like the main title of a document. You might have a level 2, which might be the title of a chapter, or level 3, which might be like a subheading or something like that. So heading level 1 says this is a heading, so that's going to be printed as a heading on the page. And then you've got a paragraph of text. So the P tag means paragraph and everything inside of it, so it ends down here. Everything inside of it is paragraph, and that's the text, the main sort of text you see in the page. You can have tags nested inside of other tags. So in this example, there's a strong tag. Strong means that it's going to have strong emphasis. So the word's formatted differently in this case because they're between strong and the ending of the strong. Would be given strong emphasis. But they'd still also be formatted as a paragraph because they're also inside that paragraph tag. Okay, so that's kind of how HTML works. I do have a slide here that shows those tags and what they mean. The purpose behind this slide really is so that it's in the handout. If you go to my website and download the PDF version of these slides, you'll have all the stuff that I said. And I like to do that because I like the handout to be kind of like your own portable Scott, if you will. Obviously, you'll not remember every single thing I said as I go through this, but you can always go back and review by looking at that handout. Now, again, I don't have time to go in full depth of everything about HTML. Obviously, that would be a very long session, and we only have an hour. So instead, what I have here is links, and these links go to w3schools.com. So there's a link to a tutorial to help you learn HTML, and also the complete reference manual, both at w3schools.com. w3schools.com is a free site. It does not cost anything, and it is my favorite site to learn web technology, and in fact it is the biggest site for learning web technology on the internet, so that's why I use that one, and I hope you take advantage of it as well. So the next technology that I wanted to talk about is called CSS, which stands for Cascading Style Sheets. And one of the things that I forgot to point out back 2 slides when we were looking at the HTML, there was a tag in there. It was called link, and it pointed to another file called style.css. And what that is a style sheet. So it's the HTML points to a file, and then the file would be formatted something like this. So remember we looked at that HTML, we had a paragraph and the paragraph of text. Well, when you say something is a paragraph, that doesn't exactly tell the browser how to display it, right? It just says that it's a paragraph, and the browser has to have rules in it saying it should be printed in, say, black as the color, and it should be given this particular font and this particular size and this particular formatting. So there's these default rules like that in the browser of how something is displayed. The idea behind CSS is that you can override those rules and completely control the exact specifications for how something is displayed. So in this CSS file, I'm overriding the display for paragraph. Now there's lots and lots of different attributes that it knows about how a paragraph is displayed, but the ones that I specified here are just overriding those particular attributes. So I'm changing the font to be an Arial font, making sure that it's black by setting the color, and that the background color is white. So that's a very simple sort of example of overriding the paragraph tag, the P tag to be, specified a different way. And also the strong emphasis, I wanted to make sure this was really strong, so I made sure it was bold, but not just bold, I made the font size 150%. So it'll be 150% of what the paragraph font would be, making it bigger. And that's the basic idea, right? We can do all sorts of things. Again, this is just a very simple, basic introduction to CSS, or basic review of CSS. To learn more about it, and there's just lots and lots to learn, go on to w3schools.com, and I've given you the link for that. So if you download the handout from my website, you'll have that link, and you can go ahead and learn all that if you need to. And then the third technology that's kind of a major technology in web programming is JavaScript. And this is not to be confused with Java, by the way. That is actually a pet peeve of mine. People will, I'll spend time teaching people JavaScript, and then they'll start referring to it as Java, and that frustrates me because they're not even close to the same thing, right? They have similar names, but they're not otherwise related at all other than their names. So JavaScript is what runs in the web browser. Java would be something you would run on the server, like on your IBM I, serving the same kind of role that RPG would. All right, so JavaScript is a programming language that runs in the browser. It allows you to do any sort of logic you want. And HTML and CSS didn't have any logic, right? They were just how something looks. JavaScript allows us to do things like if statements and loops and all the programming stuff that you're used to doing when you do programming. So here's again, very simple, basic example, but an example of JavaScript. The idea here is we've got some HTML, so I've got a form down here. This HTML form has two input fields. So you see input tags. And what I wanted to do is add the two together, just as a very simple example. So the first input field has an ID of field 1, the second one has an ID of field 2, and the user can type into those fields. They can type a number. And then I've got a third tag down here. This is a div. Div is a division tag, so it's just a section of the page. And what I've got is I've got a div with an ID of result, and it's empty right now. You see there's nothing between the start of the div tag and the end of the div tag. And what I plan to do then is change this div tag, so change it to show the total of the two numbers by adding them together. All right, so a simple example of logic. You'll see that over here it says on blur add fields. So what on blur means, well, first of all, in order to understand that, when you put the cursor into a field in web, that's called giving that field focus. So they use the term focus for where the cursor is. So whatever has the cursor position is called focused. If you want something to happen when the user moves the cursor out of a field, it's run on blur. So blur being the opposite of focus, right? So on blur runs when somebody moves the cursor out of a field. So what this does then is it runs an add fields JavaScript function, and that's what's written up here. So we see add fields JavaScript function, and it does gets field 1, it gets field 2, and it gets result. And then what it does is it takes field 1's value, converts it to a number. It's normally a character string, converts it to a number. Takes field 2's value, also converts that to a number, and you see the plus sign, which will add the two together. So then the result of that is put in the results, which is again, it was a division of the page, so it has inside of it an HTML. That would be where this empty space is here. that inner HTML is set to that number. So this actually changes what's on the page to show that number. So as you typed in this application, you could type a number and tab to the next field, and it would add the numbers together, and it would be like a very sort of simple calculator that just adds two numbers together. All right, so it's a very simple example of JavaScript. Again, can't go into full detail. I do have a link to W3 Schools where you can go and learn about that as well. But those are the basic building blocks of any web page. And it doesn't matter what language you write in. They all use those same three technologies. It doesn't matter if it's PHP or Java or RPG or anything else. In fact, the first web pages that were built with a program so that you could do logic, you could do things like, originally there was a lot of things like shopping carts were done as kind of the first like program logics. And then, you know, it would later do other things, looking things up in databases, basically, right? Looking up business logic and showing it on a web page. So the first ones were done in C. Now, this is kind of the original way that they were written. So you can see what happens is you configure your web server to call this program, this C program, when a URL contains a particular string. So maybe you would say when the URL contains hello world, call this C program then would print the HTML. And the fact that it's doing logic that prints the HTML allows you to make the page look however you want. So you can do any kind of logic you need to do, look things up in a database, whatever you want. In this case, it's really simple logic. Again, because we only have so much time, we don't want to spend a lot of time on this. But it declares a variable. It's just a character variable, so a string contains the word world, and then it comes down here and just prints the HTML document. And at the appropriate spot in the document, it prints the word world. So it'll say hello world, and then whatever is output from this then is sent on to the web server, which sends it on to the browser, and the browser sees this HTML document and it says hello world. All right, so that's how the basic server-side logic was originally done. This didn't last real long, however, because it was so awkward with all those print statements to code HTML documents. And in fact, a lot of the times people would want their marketing department to be able to change the programs, because marketing, if this is a public-facing website, marketing would want to keep changing the look and feel to make the company look good and keep people coming back. And it was really hard for them as non-programmers to go in and change that. Generally, marketing people know HTML, but they don't know the programming logic. So what gave this problem gave birth to applications like this. This example is PHP, but there's a lot of different programming languages that provide web support in this way. It's what I call smart pages type support. The idea is when you code your program, this is your source for your program, right? When you're writing your program, you actually type statements originally in HTML. So you're not just coding PHP when you start a PHP program. And it's not just PHP. Net.data is another example. Microsoft has ASP, which is the same thing. Java has JSP, which is the same thing. But you code HTML, and then when you want to put actual program logic, there's a special kind of tag. And what that tag is varies a little bit from programming language to programming language. In this case, it's PHP, so question mark PHP starts PHP code. And then everything from there until the end of the tag, which is this question mark greater than sign down here, is just PHP code. And so you can code your logic in there. So what happens is the PHP program runs, it runs the logic and outputs that, and anywhere that you don't have logic, it just outputs whatever is there as is, and you end up with this web page that says, has a body, and then the body would have hello world, where it puts that logic in there. So again, there's lots of different programming languages that work this way, and this became the standard for web programming because it's much easier to code the HTML, and it's also a lot easier for someone who is familiar with HTML but not a programmer to go in and change it, because the programming logic tends to be small pieces of it. Most of the code tends to be the HTML, and they can change that as much as they want. So that's kind of the history of how we evolved to where we are. So now the question is, should you use RPG for web programming? And there are pros and cons for sure. Now originally, when you coded stuff in RPG, it was bad news because it was similar to that C example. You would do something like eval variable equals, and you put your HTML in the string, and then you do some API call to write it out, and that was very cumbersome. But that's not really true today. There's lots of tools out there that let you have something much more like the Java or PHP approach in RPG. In fact, there are smart page softwares, and I've got a slide about that coming up, that are specifically for RPG. Or there's open source, completely free things that you can download that give you a really good way of writing HTML in RPG. So that's not really a problem anymore. So what it really boils down to is that if you want to find a developer to write web, the big advantage to using something like PHP or Java or anything that's more of a web language is really that you can find developers who are already familiar with HTML and hire them, or you can find examples on the web. Now, it's important to understand that the HTML, the CSS, and the JavaScript are being output by any language, and they're exactly the same. It doesn't matter if it's RPG or PHP or Java. Doesn't matter. You always output those same technologies, and they still look exactly the same. So the advantage is really that the programmers are already familiar with those things. On the other hand, if you plan to teach your developers, your existing staff, then you might choose RPG. RPG has big advantages because it's a better language for writing database. It's a better language for number handling. Just business logic in general tends to be better in RPG. And it's just as easy to output web in today's RPG as it is in any other language. So you may not be able to find developers who are already familiar with it, but if you're willing to teach them and you've got a lot of logic already in RPG, it's a lot easier to teach your existing developers how to code web in RPG if they're already familiar with RPG than it would be a whole another language. And you can stick with just one language then for your whole spiel, which is a really good way to do things. So you've got those pros and cons. But let's assume then that you want to do programming in RPG. How do you do that? So smart page type technology is available in RPG using vendor products. The company I work for makes one called RPGSP, which is short for RPG Smart Pages. But this isn't a sales pitch, and that's not what this session's about. It's just about giving you information. So one of our competitors, ProData, also has the same kind of technology available. But actually what I'm going to show you, rather than use these vendor tools, I'm going to show you a free one, CGI Dev 2. Now this isn't exactly the same as a smart page would be, but it's a similar sort of thing. Instead of using specially formatted tags to put RPG code in your HTML, the RPG and HTML are actually completely separate in CGI Dev 2. But this is the most popular way of writing web applications in RPG, and it's completely free. So you can download it and use it. If you end up not liking it, want to use something else, you can still do that. You haven't lost anything because it's free. So this is how you do it in CGI Dev 2. You code your HTML in a separate file. So this is just a file in the IFS. And this is how it works. You can split your HTML up into sections. And that's important because you might want to write pieces out in a loop without writing the whole thing in a loop. So you can do that. You can split it into sections and write out one section at a time. So the /$ means the start of a section. All right, so instead of HTML tags, they've got that, though this is configurable. So /$ is just the default, but /$ top means we've got a section named top, and then everything from there until the next /$ is one section. So if I do on my RPG code, I say I want to write the section named top, it will write all of this out to the browser. And then I might want to repeat something in a loop. So maybe I've got a detail section. So I've got the detail section here, which is just one line. But I could write that in a loop. I could write it over and over again. And each time you write it, it would add on to the end of what you had. But in this case, you probably wouldn't because it's a simple hello world program. So I would just have hello. But then I want to insert some variable from my program. So if I wanted to put the word from a variable in my program, I can do /%. /% is a special piece of data that means a variable should be inserted here. So /% followed by the variable name and then %/. So in this case, the variable is named var, and I'll say in my RPG code, update the HTML variable named var to contain the word world. And then when I write the detail section, it'll write hello world. So that's how CGI Dev 2 works. So why don't we go ahead and look at a more sort of sophisticated example. Oh, I kind of mentioned this as I was going around, but I forgot that I had this slide in here. But I wanted to also tell you on the RPG side of things. So you've got RPG code that drives this HTML code. And one of the cool things about the RPG and HTML being completely separate, by the way, it's a lot easier for someone like a marketing department to go in and edit it because there's absolutely no program code in the HTML. But anyway, so there's a routine. So this is a sub-procedure called getHTML_IFS provided by CGI Dev 2. You call that and you pass it where in the IFS that HTML file is. So that's how it finds it. Then you tell it to loading input. It'll take any input that came from the browser. It loads that inside of CGI Dev 2, and then you can get each variable from the browser by doing get variable. Update HTML variable I mentioned on the last slide. That's how you update data that goes in there. So you insert variables into your HTML from your RPG with this call, and then write section writes one of those sections out. So let's go ahead and look at an example. This is a more sophisticated example. The idea is to put a listing of products out. So it's just going to print a HTML table containing our product file. So you'll see I've got the table tag here. The TH tags are the headings for the table. So TR starts a row, and then you've got headings. TH are each cell of the table or each column. And in this case, they'll contain these fields. So these are the headings. And that's the end of that section. So the program will write that. And then in a loop, it'll write all the products that go in there. So we've got in the detail section here, we've got one called TR that starts a row. So this is going to be one row in the table. And in that row, we're going to have columns for the product ID. This is the variable name for product ID, variable name for product name. And then we've got variables for the product's price and stock quantity that would be written in there. These even have a class assigned to it. A class is a CSS class, so in CSS I could format the numbers differently if I wanted to. But you'd write that detail section in a loop, and then you'd write the bottom, which I don't have on there because this is just an excerpt. And then that would, put that table on the display. So from the RPG side of things, this is what it looks like. This is just a regular RPG code, nothing special. It's not a special language. It's compiled with the IBM RPG compiler. But it does use the CGI Dev 2 service program, which gives it these sub-procedures. So I call getHTML_IFS. This points in the IFS to that file that we just looked at, that file that contains that table tag and stuff like that. I'm getting any input in case there is any from the browser. And then I'm writing a section. So the section called keywords was had the HTML keywords at the top. And then I'm doing an SQL statement. So this is just standard RPG, right, to read a database, and I'm reading the products file with all the columns that we want. Then I'm writing top. This is what had the top of that table in it. And then I'm going in a loop as long as there are more columns, and for each column that I read from the database, I'm writing out the product ID, name, price, and stock quantity. So update HTML variable PRID. PRID, the first parameter to this PRID will be the /%PRID that I had in the HTML. And the data that I'm putting in that variable is actually, I use the same name as the database in this case, but the database field PRID comes from that products file that I'm reading. So that's going to put that in there, and then it's going to do the same thing for the name, and then this price and the stock quantity. Now this output is always a character field, so if I have a numeric field like the price and stock quantity, I just put it in %character to make it a character field. All right, but that'll update those variables, and then I can write out that detail section. It writes out one row of the table. The loop continues, loads the next database record down here, and then comes up and writes another one for that database record and keeps doing it until the whole products file is written out. At the end, I write out the bottom, which will be the bottom of the table, which I didn't show on the slide. That slide was just an excerpt, but it's just the bottom, the ending tags for the table. And then *fini is a special value that when I write that out, that tells CGI Dev 2, CGI Dev 2 has been buffering all the data that I send. So when I say *fini, it says, okay, Scott is done, and that's when it sends it on to the web browser. Okay, so that's how that works. This is what it would look like in this case. But I can go ahead and actually run it so you can see what it looks like. Let's see, I've got my web browser here, and I've set up my Apache server on IBMI. So that any URL that starts with RPG is going to call a program. It's going to call an RPG program. And I compiled that example that we just looked at into a program named prod_orig. Okay? And then when I run this, it's going to go ahead and do that. It's going to output that table. So boom, there it is. And you can see this is the whole file. So, you know, it did take, you know, a half second or so to run, but that's because there's so many records and I had to read through them all and put them all in here. I did do some CSS in here, which I didn't show when I went through the code, but the CSS just makes this top line of the table look, you know, like that. It gives it the different color and so forth. All right, but, you know, that's how you write a web page in RPG. And like I said, if you were coding this in PHP or Java or Python or Node.js or any of the other more web technologies, you would still output the exact same HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So there's no real disadvantage to doing this in RPG, aside from, you know, maybe the lack of talent. So that type of approach is what we call Web 1.0. And the idea behind Web 1.0 is that it will actually output HTML from a program on the server. Now, this was a very simple textbook example, but you could even see that I was only showing excerpts of the HTML because there was too much to show you. In a real example where everything is really fancy and looking nice, it can get really complex and unwieldy to deal with. There's just a lot of code, and it can take a while to write it all. In fact, coding everything the way you want it to work, for me, can take a lot of time, and you feel like instead of spending your time working on the business logic, you know, in this case, business logic was as simple as just reading a file, but you find like you're spending all your time kind of working on what I call the plumbing, kind of the stuff that makes it all work, right? So like, for example, if this were an input screen where you're typing something in and you wanted the user to only be able to type a number in it, well, you'd have to write JavaScript code to make sure that they can only type a number, because normally any characters would be allowed in a field in web programming. If you only wanted capital letters, same thing. You'd have to write JavaScript, or maybe you'd want data formatted in a particular way. So the idea is you find yourself writing all these sort of little JavaScript routines to do all sorts of things. And that's, you know, that can get cumbersome after a while. So Web 2.0 is generally the better approach. And Web 2.0, you do a lot of JavaScript, but you do so with something called a JavaScript framework. So you download a framework usually. You could write your own, but most of the time you download them. There's lots of them out there that are free. And it kind of does a lot of that JavaScript for you. It's already sort of pre-written, and you call it. It's like a big library of routines. One of the most important things that you find in JavaScript frameworks is AJAX. So AJAX, it stands for asynchronous JavaScript and XML, but it's kind of transcended that. You know, it's not just used that way anymore. But the idea is that JavaScript can make its own web request to your IBMI, run your RPG program or whatever language you decided to use, and get back the data, and then it can modify the page. But, you know, like the JavaScript example I showed you before, it was, in that case, it's very simple. It was just modifying one div to show a number. But here we can change anything on the page without having to redisplay the page. So with AJAX and with frameworks, we can modify bits and pieces of the page as the user does things. So as they type or as they move the mouse or whatever they're doing. So think about a social network site like Facebook or LinkedIn. I think most people use something like, you know, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, something like that. And think about how the screen looks, right? There's usually a column where it's showing everything that's happening, like people are posting status updates or adding images or showing things, and that's constantly changing. Every time someone posts a comment, you see the new comment pop up. When somebody sends you a message, a little marker pops up telling you you have a new message. All of this is happening without having to redraw that page. So think about that. If you used the Web 1.0 technology and it had to redraw the page every single time anything changed, that would be really hard to use, and it would be really complicated code, and it would be very slow as well. So that's the idea in Web 2.0, is that you can interact a lot more because the JavaScript code can be talking to a server, can be getting stuff from databases, it can be seeing what other people are doing, and just modifying the page as you sit there. All right, so all of this is done with these things called frameworks, and frameworks are big libraries of JavaScript code. That's all they are. Somebody wrote a JavaScript code to allow only numeric fields and to format something on the screen a particular way and to talk to your server and update the screen. all these routines have been written already and put in a library, and you can download them. And that's what a framework is. So frameworks are the kind of the core of Web 2.0. So I want to demonstrate that same product list example, but I want to use a framework. A framework that I'm the most familiar with is the Profound UI framework, which I'm one of the authors of, along with other people I work with. This is a completely open source framework created by Profound Logic. So you can go and download it. Now I'm showing you this because it's the one I'm most familiar with. I'm not necessarily, saying that it's the one you should use. You can use whatever you like, but this is the one that I'm going to show you, okay? And it is free, so I'm not selling it. There are, like EXTJS is a really good one for business applications. That's free. You can download it, and it's got a mobile version called Central Touch. jQuery is probably the most popular framework in the world, and it's got jQuery Mobile, which is for mobile applications. There's a lot of them out there, though, that are available. Most of them are free, and so, for example, Bootstrap has become really popular lately. But these are just examples. I'm not going to try to go in depth on all of these frameworks, but I'm going to show you Profound UI. Profound UI, again, remember the JavaScript is doing the communication with the RPG program, and it's not just getting back HTML to display, but it's just getting back data from the program, which it can use to manipulate the page. So it's going to do this by sending and receiving data in a format known as JSON. And now Ajax says XML in the name, but that was the original way to do it. But today Ajax is used more with JSON than anything else. And so I'll show you the JSON format. I've got details on the slide of what the JSON format is, but I'll actually show it to you when we've got it on the screen. I think it's easier to understand when you can see it. So the idea behind calling the Profound UI framework, first of all, there's a simple HTML file that the browser downloads. There always is some kind of HTML that the browser downloads. And what this file is going to do really is just give us a space, just a blank div where it can draw the page. The JavaScript can draw the page in that div. And of course, it's also going to have to load in the JavaScript and CSS and anything else that's necessary to make it all work. So it's just going to basically load that stuff in and kick off the process, and then the JavaScript will take it from there. And of course, there'll be a CSS style sheet to style things. I think you get the idea. I'm not going to actually show that. And then the JSON. So the way we work with this framework is we code a JSON document that says what goes on the screen. So we want to have a grid, in the screen that has the products in it. So there'll be something in there saying this is the grid. That grid will have some fields in it. So all of this will be coded in JSON format. And then your program, your RPG program, will be run. So the JavaScript will call your program, get the data, and then it will draw this up in the grid. And we're still going to use CGI Dev 2 for our example here, so I'm not getting into anything commercial. Everything I'm showing you here is free open source. So let's go ahead and look at that. So here's that HTML file I was talking about. You can see it brings in the CSS to style things a particular way. Runtime.js, that is the JavaScript framework itself, so it's just doing an HTML tag that tells it to fetch that and run it in the browser. And then when the page is finished loading, so all this stuff is finished loading, this function window.onload will run. And what it does is it sets a variable with the name of the RPG program. Remember, I had a URL before where /RPG meant to run an RPG program, so I've got /RPG. In this case, I'm running a program called prodlist. And then when I do PUI start, that starts up the framework. The framework will call the program, get the data, and it will draw the data on the screen. It always draws the data into a div named PUI. So I've got just an empty div with ID PUI. It'll get that and change its value on the screen as we go along. Okay? Here is the framework example. So when you design your screen, you tell what items go on the screen. In this case, the main thing was a big grid, or a grid like a table that has all the products in it. So you code JSON, and this is what JSON looks like. So in our example, we have an array called items. So you can see that this square bracket here, this starts an array in JSON format. And then you'll have stuff separated by commas in the array. In this case, it's an array of what's called objects. Objects are like data structures in RPG. So the curly brace starts an object, and then we've got fields in the object. So you've got field name and then a colon and then the value. So that's how fields in an object or fields in a data structure work. So here I've got all these fields, and it tells how to make the grid. So it says the grid has an ID of this, and the field type is a grid. That's how it knows it's a grid. It's got a CSS class. It's got a number of rows in the grid. It's got a number of columns. This is how wide each column is. These are the column headings, etc. So that's how we code in Profound UI. In the Profound UI framework, we say we want this item on the screen. That ends, and then we've got more items. So I've got a field, an output field that goes, so you see the curly brace starts another object and ends down there. So that's the second thing in the items array, and it says that this output field goes in this grid, and it says that it goes in the first column. They're numbered from 0, so column 0 is the first column in the grid. And the value of it is going to come from a variable. So it says the field is named PRID, product ID, and it's a character field, and it's 10 long. And so we've got the same thing down here. We've got the product name, same output field. It's in column 1 of the grid, and it's called product name, and it's character in a 30 long, and so forth. So you'll have that for all the different fields that go on the screen, and then you can display it. So when the framework calls your RPG program will actually work exactly the same as the previous example. The RPG code is actually the same. The only difference is which template in the IFS you use, okay? So it's going to point to a JSON template instead of pointing to an HTML template. And this is what that JSON template looks like. We've got the same sections, but it's got in here a variable. Now instead of coding HTML, we're coding JSON. So we've got a JSON section here in the top instead of HTML, and it's got a field called view. This actually points to that JSON that has all the different fields on the screen and how they look, which was on the previous slide. And then we've got the data. So this is the data that will go in the subfile, and then we're writing out these data fields. We've got product ID, name, price, and stock quantity, and that's what'll go in those columns, and it'll come from these CGI Dev2 variables. So we'll write that detail in a loop just like we did before, and we'll write out the whole thing. Now before, remember when I did the HTML, I said it was just an excerpt because it was too long to fit on the slide and too much stuff. Notice how much simpler it is when we're outputting JSON. This is the whole document. It all fits in this case. So that's, that's one of the cool things about it, is that it is simpler. And so this is what the output should look like. Again, I can show you that. I can actually run it. So I will open up a new tab in my browser and actually run that guy. And I've got it on the same web server. I called it this py framework /prod list. And so boom, it runs. And there we go. We got it using the framework. Now this is doing exactly the same thing as the original example, but it's done in Web 2.0, where everything on the screen can be changed on the fly. Now, you might think to yourself, well, this framework seemed actually more complicated than the original example, and that is true, but it does save you time. So, yeah, it is the same, but I think you can see it looks a little bit nicer. Excuse me. It looks a little bit nicer, but you can see this has got like a 3D effect on it. Every other line is shaded. It scrolls within just the grid. So all of that, and you can see when the mouse moves over, it highlights it with the mouse. All of that is part of the framework. The framework is what's doing all that for us. So yeah, the code may be a little bit more complicated, but it does more things. It's hard because this is a textbook example and it's so simple, it's hard to really show you the advantages. But the real payoff is that when you're in the framework, you can take advantage of all the code that's in the framework. So the real payoff is that we can take advantage of that, and just getting it all started may be more work, but now I can just call whatever in the framework I want. So in this example, I'm going to show you these different things. So I've got the code for this loaded here. Here is the actual JSON that we were looking at on the screen, and it's got that grid in it that I was talking about. And what I'm going to do is I want to enable some new features on here that HTML doesn't have. These are just features that I can add. So these 4 lines of code, I put them in a separate file here so I can just kind of copy and paste them in and show them to you. So I'll paste that in there, and so there it is. I do need a comma here. But that's it. So I'm turning on these features. They're called sortable columns, resizable columns, movable columns, and persist state. And once I've added that in, I'll save my changes there. And then we can go back to the web browser and look at that now with those changes. So I'm going to reload this. And so what these things do, sortable columns I didn't have to write any code, just one line of code really in that JSON file. Now when I click on this, the columns are sortable. So this sorted by price. I can sort by, any of the columns. And how much work would that have been if I had to code that in RPG? It also toggles. So like if I'm sorting by price, it's in ascending order. If I click on it again, it switches to descending order. I can also right click and choose ascending or descending directly. All of that is just by that one line of code to enable that. Another option that it was in there was called movable columns, which means that I can actually take the column and drag it. Sorry, I think I missed there, didn't I? So I can actually take the column and drag it, and you can see it actually moves the columns around. So that's pretty cool, isn't it? I mean, that might allow your user to go and like configure this however they want. Another thing it had in there was resizable columns. So that maybe you say, oh, this price column is taking up, or it needs to be bigger, for example. So I could drag that over and make it bigger. I can drag this resize these things right here in the web browser without, having to write any code. Again, one line of code saying resizable columns. So sortable, resizable, movable, I've shown you all those. The other thing was persist state. So once the user has got this the way they want, persist state tells the web browser to remember this. And then if I were to close that and do it all over again, to run that page again, it will bring it up the same way it was before with the columns resized and so forth. And it's still sorted. I had it sorted by product ID. It's still sorted by that because of that persist state. And it's just remembered in the browser. So all of that, I don't know how many lines of code that would have been to actually write it all myself. But it's 4 lines of code with the framework. And I think that way you can kind of see what I mean, right? This does save you time. Hopefully that made sense. So that's just I've got a slide that shows the same things, but we looked at this already. So it does save you time. And this is just, again, a very simple sort of textbook example. The more stuff you do and the more sophisticated your screen is, the more the framework's going to save you time and allow it to be more interactive and all of that stuff. All right, so that's Web 2.0. The last thing that I wanted to see, wanted to show you the third choice, if you will, a third alternative, was open access. The idea behind open access, now open access has been around since 2010. IBM added it originally as a paid-for product. They changed their minds because people like me kind of started a campaign and said, we don't want to have to pay for this. They changed their minds in 2012 and made this free. So it is built into the RPG compiler. If you're on V6R1 or later, you can have this at no charge. V6R1 or V7R1, you would have to install a PTF to enable it. Starting with V7R2, it is built in. It's just there, and it's in RPG, and you can use it. Okay, so it's there. And the way this works is that it allows your RPG program to call a routine when a file operation occurs. All right, so what do I mean by that? So what I mean by that, let's think about a green screen application first of all. When you do a green screen application and you code execute format, so EXFMT, followed by a format name, so you want to execute this format, what really happens under the covers is RPG has compiled in a call to a routine in the operating system. I mean, this routine to manipulate screen isn't actually in your RPG program. It's calling a part of the operating system, some routine in the operating system that goes into the DDS display file, gets all the fields and other data out of it, and generates the appropriate 5250 data stream to send to your terminal to make the screen show up. So what open access really does is it lets you control that routine. Instead of calling the routine that's built into the operating system, you can call any routine that you want, and that routine is called a handler. So what happens is when you code your file spec, it can be declare F in free format, or it can be a traditional F spec, and you have this new keyword handler, and you can tell it this is the routine I want you to call whenever a file operation occurs. In this case, you've got a service program called Profound UI, and then parentheses, and then a sub-procedure called handler in that service program. So You can call any routine you want. You can write that yourself if you want to, or if you're using a commercial routine or commercial tool that you bought from someone, then you put their routine there. And so the basic idea is, instead of RPG doing an operation code that goes right to the green screen, RPG does an operation code that calls this handler, and then this handler can go out to whatever you want. And in our case, it would be a web application, because that's what we're talking about. Obviously, this handler can do anything. It doesn't have to be screens at all, but in this case, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about web, so it would be a web application. So what are the pros and cons of using this open access approach? The big advantage is that existing programs that are already written, are already doing RPG opcodes, don't have to be changed. Other than adding this one handler keyword and recompiling, they will now work, because the logic to do all the web stuff is outside of this program, and it runs when the handler runs. Another advantage is that if you buy a commercial version of this, or if you're smart enough to write your own, the commercial versions at least all come with a full screen visual editor to make it easy to write your screens. And that allows you to concentrate on the business rules rather than the plumbing. Your code is really just the business that you've always had before. The disadvantages, well, let's say that you're going to write this yourself instead of buying one from a vendor. If you write your own handler, this is low-level programming, right? This is like systems-type programming, and it can be very complicated and take a long time to do. Of course, if you buy one from a vendor, that's all done for you, so you don't have to worry about it if you buy it from a vendor, but then you've got the cost, so that can be expensive. Though, if you compare it to replacing your application, it's not that expensive. I've run into companies actually that decided, we're going to get off of IBM i, right? They say, we're going to get off of IBM i, we're going to buy a package. I've seen them spend as much as $100 million on a new package and still have it fail. So they did it and it failed, lost the $100 million, and they're still back to their original RPG green screen programs. So by comparison to that, a cost like that, or even comparison to much cheaper solutions than that, these vendor handlers are really a bargain, right? They're a tiny fraction of that kind of cost, and they're much safer. They're much more likely to work because you're still using the same RPG code, which fits your business. Okay. It does use more memory than coding web the sort of traditional way, but memory's cheap, so I'm not going to dwell on that. So we're going to do the same example now using open access. Now pretty much all the people using open access today are using commercial solutions, and that makes it hard to show in a session like this where I'm not trying to sell you anything, because I have to use a commercial solution. So I'm going to use my company's solution that we write, that I'm one of the authors of. Obviously that's the one I know. You can write your own. Obviously I couldn't demonstrate your own that you wrote because I don't have it. There are other vendors such as Look Software, who is now part of Fresh Legacy, or Asna, who also have these things. So again, I'm not trying to give you a sales pitch. I'm just showing you ours, so I can show you open access, because I have to show you something that I'm familiar with. So this is what our screen designer looks like. I'll show you the actual thing though. I'll show you in the web browser. Our screen designer actually runs in a browser. It's not a PC program. It's a browser program, which is really nice. Like when you do upgrades and stuff, you just install it on the server, but that's neither here nor there, right? But the idea here is this middle section that looks like a sheet of graph paper is where you build your screen, and you build it by dragging these things on the left on there. These things are called widgets. They represent the fields, if you will, that go on your screen. So label is like a constant value that would go on your screen. Dynamic output field would be like an output field in green screen. Textbook would be like an input field in green screen. Sorry, text box, not textbook. But we've got lots of them here. These are just the sort of beginning ones, right? Green screen really only has those three. But here we've got other things. We've got drop downs and buttons, checkboxes, radio buttons, lots of things. So images, for example, a subfile is down here. I can just take and drag that on there. You can see what a subfile looks like. And there's lots more, right? So all these different sections expand, and they've got things in them. So there's lots of different stuff here that I can, open and bring in. There's about 150 different widgets. All right, and then once you have something on here, you've got a section here where you can name the record format, because remember, with open access, we're doing execute format, record format name, so it does need to have a record format name. So I could put my record format name here. And everything has properties. So whatever I click on, so if I click on the grid, there are properties here in this properties box that I can adjust. So if I wanted to enable those things I showed you before, like the movable columns, it's just a matter of finding that property and turning it on. So everything you can do can be set through that properties box like that. And there's lots and lots of different things in here. All right, so that's the basics of this Visual Designer. Again, all of our competitors have Visual Designers as well. And this is one of the big advantages using open access, is that you do get tools like this. So let's load in. This is that screen that I was showing you. I showed you doing it free where you coded the JSON yourself. We actually use the same framework. That open source Profound UI framework is what our designer generates as well, so you'll see that the screen actually looks the same, but it's much easier to build it in the designer. I dragged in the grid, I dragged in these dynamic output fields here, and I connected them to variables. All right, and then on the RPG side of things, the only difference I would make versus a green screen is adding in that handler. So if we go back to the PowerPoint document here, all right, that's what it looked like. I showed you that already. But the RPG code is just reading the SQL statement, but it's got this handler keyword, so it can actually just do a write. So we're writing to a subfile, just like you would in green screens. It just does a write, and you don't have all that update HTML logic. And then to display the screen, it's just execute format. So it's just standard RPG code because all the logic to do the web is in the handler. All right, so if I go ahead and run that, you'll actually see that this looks exactly like the Web 2.0 approach that I showed you. So there really isn't a lot. Oh, sorry, that was the wrong button. There really isn't a lot to show you here, but I'll just run it again so you can see. So this is just that same RPG program that I showed you. It's just writing to a subfile just like it was green screen, but it gives you that same grid that we saw before. Okay? So that is the open access approach. Really, it does the same thing. It just saves you time and allows you to use your existing applications. Okay? So to summarize all this, first of all, if we go back and we look at what the way web has evolved, we've come a long way from those days when you had to type printf with HTML tag names in C. Come a long way from those days, right? Things have gotten a lot better. With Web 2.0, we've made things much more interactive. In my opinion, RPG is a better language for writing business rules. So if you think about the fact that the HTML and CSS and JavaScript that your program outputs in a web application will be exactly the same no matter what language you code it in, whether it's Java or PHP or Python, not MySQL, Node.js, whatever it is, it doesn't matter if it's those things or if it's RPG, you're outputting the exact same HTML, CSS, JavaScript, okay? So if RPG can do this just as well as other languages, the advantages are really about whether you've got the talent in-house or you've got the personnel in-house, whether you have to hire them, how difficult it might be to hire someone in RPG versus someone in another environment. And that's really where the decision is. But since RPG is better for business applications and the HTML side of things is exactly the same, you know, there's a strong case for doing it in RPG. And then Web 2.0 being better than Web 1.0, you know, it's passé to actually write out HTML today. Use a framework. They make things much more interactive, they make things look nicer, and they save you a lot of work. Open access saves you work further by allowing your existing programs to work without changes, and with the added benefits of buying a vendor package that would give you like a designer and things like that, makes it easier to write your screens. So it does cost money, but it does make things a lot easier and allow you to be more productive, okay? You can always get the latest copy of the handouts for this or any of my presentations on my website. So if you wanted to try out the different links and so forth that we saw throughout this presentation, the easiest thing to do is go to scottclement.com/presentations, get the PDF copy of these slides, and then you'll have all the links and everything, and you can review it and use it, you know, however you want to use it. Okay, so thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this session. So yeah, thank you. Bye.